The Vax RE were apex predators who had conquered hundreds of humid jungle worlds. When High Command locked onto the peninsula the humans called Florida, they expected a flawless stealth conquest under the cover of dense swamps. They dropped into the Everglades at dusk in August. It was 98 degrees Fahrenheit, with 110% humidity. The air wasn't just heavy. Inhaling it felt like breathing hot soup. In a mere 3 minutes, the Vax RE's vaunted optical camo suits short-circuited in a shower of sparks due to the extreme moisture. Their prized thermal imagers, faced with muck and trees that matched their own blood temperature, turned into glaring blind spots. Stealth Captain Vale signaled his 5-man squad to wade forward. That was his last tactical mistake. A 12-foot alligator named Princess didn't give a damn about interstellar hierarchies. She only cared about her territory. The water erupted. As the captain was dragged under, the remaining squad scrambled onto the muddy bank, only to be instantly blinded by a 1,000,000 candle power spotlight. A flat-bottomed airboat tore through the sawgrass with a deafening roar. It was the middle of the night, and Chuck was wearing reflective aviators, cut-off jorts, and holding an ice-cold can of Busch Light. Woo-wee, Chuck hollered over the roar of the fan engine. Look at the size of them iguanas, Bob. Grab the net. We're making some new boots. Bob, sporting peeling, sunburned shoulders and forearms covered in tattoos, so caked with salt and mud you couldn't read them anymore, had been itching to use his 6-foot heavy-duty dip net. Riding the bow wave pushed by the airboat, he threw his entire weight forward. His thick arms swung with a whoosh, and the aluminum net, heavily weighted with lead sinkers, smashed into the churning water with a heavy thud. Captain Vale had just pried his shoulder armor from Princess's crushing jaws, bursting from the surf, choking on foul, muddy water. His pristine Vax RE optical camo was now caked in shit-brown mud, the perfect cloaking system entirely shorted out and popping with frantic blue sparks. Gritting his mandibles, he reached for his hip-mounted plasma dagger, just about to pry open his locked armor joints, when the net came crashing down on his head. Thick nylon rope instantly tangled his arms and his weapon, and the heavy lead sinker clobbered him right in the back of the skull, driving him face first into chest-deep, rotting sludge. Bob jammed the hardwood handle into the boat's gunwale bracket and leaned his entire body weight onto it, pinning Vale's head mercilessly into the stinking muck. Foul mud flooded through the stealth suits, ventilation seams right into the exoskeleton. With every struggle, Vale sank another half-inch. The armor's insulation layer, thoroughly soaked by the 110% humidity, had turned into a massive conductor. Sizzling electrical currents paralyzed his limbs, rendering him incapable of squeezing out even a single coherent scream. Chuck pulled back on the throttle, letting the airboat drift. The 1,000,000 candle power spotlight swept across the sawgrass on the bank, leaving the 4 remaining Vax RE soldiers crouching in the shadows with nowhere to hide. Clutching their blinded compound eyes, the 4 aliens stumbled backward, the bone spikes on the backs of their necks standing rigid. In unison, their hands reached for the plasma cutters slung across their backs. In the oppressive, sticky wind, the joints of the 4 remaining stealth operatives' armor had long since flooded with slimy swamp condensation. Their optical camo energy lines had tripped and blown, and their once crystal-clear thermal screens were now just a blizzard of white static. The engine roar of the airboat, a mere 10 paces away, rattled the inner walls of their armor. Gripping their barely functional plasma cutters, they raised their muzzles blindly into the agonizing glare of the spotlight. Their fingers had barely touched the triggers when a skull-numbing buzz swarmed right into their faces. A dense, dark brown cloud of bloodthirsty Florida mosquitoes swarmed them, funneling through the armor breaches torn by the gator and the suit's exhaust vents. Vax RE biology was naturally and extremely allergic to Earth's insect toxins. The first operative barely felt a pinprick on his upper arm before his airway swelled shut in less than 3 seconds. His previously sharp compound eyes instantly ballooned into 2 purple blood-filled sacs. Screaming, he dropped his plasma cutter and pitched headfirst into waist-deep mud. Toxic swamp water instantly flooded the breaches in his armor as he convulsed and rolled uncontrollably. The second operative fared even worse. 3 mosquitoes drilled right through the ventilation seams on his neck and bit directly into his flesh. The allergic reaction detonated his lymphatic system, swelling half his torso into a grotesque balloon. Unable to scream, he tumbled into the mud pit alongside his comrade, his throat emitting only a ragged, wheezing hiss. The remaining 2 squad members froze, their fingers trembling too violently to grip their weapons. They could hear the sickening rustle of mosquitoes landing on the outer layer of their armor. They could feel the tiny proboscises probing the gaps. Through the static of their damaged communicators, an intermittent stuttering distress signal drifted through the thick reeds toward the temporary Vax RE camp, 3 kilometers away. Inside the command pod at the temporary camp, the stuttering distress alarm pierced air so thick and humid you could wring water from it. On the holographic tactical board, 2 of the 4 Vanguard signals instantly flatlined into ash gray. The remaining 2 red dots jumped frantically, while a dense swarm of red toxicological warnings crawled across half the screen. The ground commander tapped the condensation-fogged touchscreen, only to pull up a few fragmented, static-laced screams. Mosquito swarm. Stealth suits shorted. Armor flooded. Throat swelled shut. His rough exoskeletal joints cracked as he clenched his fists. The most elite stealth squad in the Vaxari military had lost half its men in a mud puddle on this primitive rock. And to bugs. Glancing at the airspace heat map, he completely dismissed the puny native watercraft and immediately punched in the reinforcement override. Warm up 3 light hoverskiffs. 15 fully armed shock troopers. Scramble and launch. Low-altitude fire blanket. Burn that reed bed to ash. Out on the flooded flats, the anti-gravity engines of the 3 light hover skiffs roared to life, violently blowing aside knee-high water weeds and reeking muck. 15 shock troopers piled into the skiffs, gripping their plasma cutters, their brand-new optical camo visors gleaming coldly in the dusk. The formation lifted off, dropping their flight path low to trace the distress beacon straight toward the combat zone. The metallic hulls sliced through the oppressive, heavy twilight, their wake over the swamp canopy, as clear as a line carved in the air. Down below, dozens of civilian smartphone cameras scattered across RV parks, fishing shacks, and hunting blinds along the swamp's edge, simultaneously captured the uninvited guests. Across the fringes of the South Florida Everglades, on the folding canvas chairs of fishing shacks, inside pickup truck cabs, and under the awnings of travel trailers, hundreds of sweat and bug-splattered phones vibrated to life. A local group chat named Everglades Exotic Catch Checklist instantly exploded. The first to post was Old Tom, the guy who sold gator skin wallets by the highway. He uploaded 3 moisture-blurred but unmistakable photos, 3 silver-gray, saucer-shaped light hover skiffs flying dead low, clipping vines right off the cypress branches. Holy shit, them ain't aliens, are they? YouTube said Texas had UFOs last week. How'd they get down here? Don't give a damn what they are. They're trespassing, and they're gonna get a whoopin'. I got a whole trunk full of rigged anti-poacher drones I ain't even cracked open yet. Count me in. I got one strapped with 3 bottle rockets, was saving 'em for the 4th of July. In air thick as syrup, the buzzing rotors of over a dozen civilian drones suddenly rose up. Bare-chested locals hiding in the woods, black mud caked under their fingernails, scrambled to zip-tie extra flares and firework fuses to their drones. One guy, figuring it was too much hassle, just duct-taped a half-empty bottle of whiskey to his rig for a counterweight, swearing that even if it didn't blow him up, it'd smash the sumbitch's windshields. In under 10 minutes, a loose formation of drones trailing sparking firework fuses followed the low-pressure wake of the hover skiffs, diving straight into the airspace above the battlefield. The 3 Vax RE light hover skiffs steadily decelerated. The shock troopers aboard had already activated the targeting systems on their plasma cutters, achieving a crystal-clear lock on the tiny civilian airboat down on the water. The lead skiff pilot was just about to hit the firing stud when a dozen blazing little black dots burst through his windshield's field of view, riding the sweltering headwind and slamming right into the hull. On the ground commander's holographic tactical screen, the green blips of the 3 hover skiffs had just locked into the combat airspace when a dozen violently bright red flares suddenly darted from the edge of the screen, tracking straight into the skiff's signal blocks. The battle-hardened VAX-RE ground commander had just assured Supreme Commander Kraxus over comms that he'd wipe out these wetland natives in 10 minutes, his finger literally hovering over the zero-casualty sweep report field. The moment the first explosion detonated, the entire holographic screen was swallowed by a blinding flash. Shrapnel from the firework casings shredded the drone shells, while scorching sparks plastered the optical lenses of the hover skiff's viewports. Thick black smoke, mixed with the 110% swamp humidity, funneled right into every sensor module. Piercing error alarms instantly flooded the command pod, every screen flashing with blinding red error codes. The targeting systems across all 3 skiffs whited out, thermal imaging and laser telemetry completely failed, and the coordinates for the human airboat vanished entirely from the radar. The ground commander smashed his calcified knuckles against the condensation-beaded waterproof console, his joints instantly slick with cold, sticky moisture. He roared orders for the skiffs to drop altitude, establish visual confirmation, and blast that damned native boat into mud. The lead hover skiff wobbled, slowly dropping to less than 30 feet above the water, leisurely circling the ripples spreading through the water hyacinths. It was completely oblivious to the fact that the massive, flat-bottomed airboat, spitting cold, foul-smelling mist, had already slipped silently into its downwind blind spot. Chuck's beer foam-coated knuckles viciously cranked the volume knob to the max. 120 decibels of southern rock instantly blew through the sticky paste-like air, vibrating the fiberglass hull of the massive airboat. Chuck's mullet thrashed to the beat. Behind his reflective aviators, his eyes shot a sideways glance at the low-hovering VAX-RE skiff. With a bare shoulder covered in mosquito bites and beer froth, he slammed hard into the rudder. The 180-horsepower flat-bottomed airboat went into a violent, splashing power slide, its massive carbon fiber fan blades violently carving into the murky swamp water. Bob, who had been pinning the struggling Captain Vale into the mud with his long dip net handle, lost his balance from the sudden lurch. Cursing, he threw his entire body weight over the net's rim, a raw, feral laugh erupting from his throat. Hell of an angle. Smoke these plastic wearin' out-of-towners. Tons of dark brown, foul-smelling sludge, completely tangled with wads of waterweed, swarms of blood-sucking mosquitoes, and half-rotted water hyacinths were violently flung skyward at 60 miles an hour. Like a massive, toxic net blotting out the sky, the payload accurately slammed into the hover skiff that hadn't even managed to spot a human shadow. The 5 VAX-RE shock troopers aboard were still frantically slapping at their snow-filled sensor screens when thick, heavy muck instantly blinded the entire forward viewport. Muddy slurry laced with waterweed aggressively flooded into the core cabin through the engine intake grills. The previously smooth, low hum of the hover engine instantly emitted a piercing metallic shriek, output power plummeting straight to zero, and the light hover skiff dropped like a bird with its bones ripped out. It plunged straight into the dark green, hyacinth-choked water, kicking up a rain of stinking mud that showered half the river. The 5 troopers, clad in their state-of-the-art optical camo, were forced to blow the hatch and abandon ship, frantically plunging into chest-deep water and desperately swimming toward the nearest muddy bank. Pushed by the current, the out-of-control, wrecked skiff dragged an erratic path, swaying heavily as it slammed straight into the muddy bank where the last 2 remaining Vanguard operatives were standing. The nerves of those 2 soldiers had already snapped after the mosquito ambush. Seeing the 2-ton hull crashing straight toward them, they didn't even have the presence of mind to fire. They simply used every ounce of strength to scramble backward into the low brush. A heel struck something hard, followed by a crisp crunch. A 2-foot-tall, red imported fire ant mound was utterly crushed. The densely packed swarm of red and black ants instantly exploded into a frenzy, violently pouring into the cracked seams of their armor, and the ventilation ports already leaking from the extreme humidity. The moment the formic acid made contact with their skin, the sheer agony was like a red-hot plasma blade slicing directly through their nerves. The Vax RE's extreme allergic reaction to Earth insect toxins detonated instantly. The two operatives couldn't even manage a complete scream. Their plasma cutters clattered into the mud and slid down the bank into the murky swamp water. Clutching their necks, they tumbled into the mud pit, their limbs locked into violently convulsing knots. Ash-white foam, a corrosive byproduct of the formic acid, bubbled continuously out of their armor seams, and in less than 10 seconds, they were completely paralyzed in the muck, dead still. With that, the entire 5-man Vax RE Vanguard stealth squad had been completely neutralized. Out on the murky swamp water, the 5 reinforcement troopers who had abandoned ship were still frantically thrashing toward the bank, their splashing violently disrupting the water's reflection. None of them noticed the dozen or so pitch-black shadows silently closing in beneath the dark green surface. Out on the water-trembling engine roar of the high-powered airboat was already ringing clearly in their ears. Chuck shoved the airboat's throttle hard into the lock position. The fiberglass exhaust fan whipped the swamp water into a massive, stinking mist, splattering the gunwales with foul mud. He raised a hand to wipe the mud flecks off his aviators, the spilled beer from his fingers mixing with the grime. Staring at the 5 Vax RE troopers floundering in the water, he cracked a wide grin and chuckled. "Light 'em up, Bob." Leaning against the bow, his knuckles white around the handle of the heavy dip net, Bob flicked the switch on the million-candle-power spotlight with his thumb. A blinding white glare erupted, illuminating the dark green water like a pane of red-hot glass. The Vax RE troopers' optical camo had long been short-circuited by the 110% humidity. Under the intense light, their full humanoid silhouettes were exposed. Their built-in thermal visors whited out completely from the glare. The 5 armored aliens could only cover their eyes and thrash blindly, instinctively fleeing toward the shadows, which just so happened to be the densest shallow water breeding ground for alligators. Mosquitoes had already funneled through their armor gaps, and the allergic reaction from the earlier fire ant formic acid had crawled all the way up their respiratory tracts. Every stroke through the water brought uncontrollable convulsions, their feet sinking deeper into the soft mud as they desperately clawed their way toward the shallows. Chuck took a swig from his half-empty can of Busch Light, the foam running down his chest hair into his belly button. He ripped the rudder hard, and the airboat scraped right past the backs of the 5 aliens. The mud kicked up by the fan blades plastered solidly against their rear armor, shoving them another 6 feet onto the shoal. Just beneath the surface, a dozen dark gator shadows had already glued themselves to the aliens' feet, the surface of the water without a single ripple. Blue-violet emergency alarm lights flashed wildly inside the Vax RE orbital medical bay, cold, clammy sweat dripping down the medical officer's exoskeleton. On the holographic tactical screen, the 5 red life signs of the swimming shock troopers were violently spasming, popping fresh toxicological red alerts every single second. Antacid anaphylaxis, respiratory edema, heart rate exceeding survival threshold. The glare from the spotlight in the background feed made him dizzy. That native pilot they called Chuck had slammed the airboat's throttle, the massive fan churning up a storm of stinking mud, pinning the 5 trapped troopers squarely onto the alligator breeding shoal. A dozen dark gator shadows were right at their feet, the red dots' vital signs plummeting one after another. The comms were flooded with the aliens' throat-tearing coughs and terrified screams, every splash of a gator's tail severing another half-segment of signal. The ground commander's static-laced voice exploded into his earpiece. "That psychotic native pilot is the core threat. Authorize the remaining 2 skiffs immediately. Fire neurodarts and paralyze him." The medical officer's claws trembled, barely able to hit the touchscreen accurately. He had spent half his life conquering the stars, seen asteroid miners and frontier bioxenomorphs, but he had never seen a low-tech planet reduce Vax RE's elite stealth forces to this, entire squads with shorted camo, whited-out thermals, and reinforced armor that couldn't even stop antacid. He ground his mandibles, pulled up weapon clearance, and remotely unlocked the micro-neuro dart firing protocols for the second and third light hover skiffs. The second his fingertip pressed down hard, the alarms shook him right to his exoskeleton. 3 kilometers above, the launch bays on the 2 hover skiffs popped open. 10 troopers huddled inside, gripping the handrails, using their last drop of reserve power to lock onto the bare-chested silhouette at the bow of the airboat. 3 silver-gray micro-neuro darts, trailing pale blue exhaust, sliced through the brutally humid air and struck Chuck dead on the side of his neck as he steered the boat. Chuck, clenching his near-empty can of Busch Light in his teeth, didn't even flinch. His aviators slipped down to the bridge of his nose. He squinted, casually slotted the beer can back into the gunwale cup holder, and reached up with 3 thick fingers caked in waterweed and mud to pinch the tails of the 3 darts embedded in his neck. Bob, just turning his head while leaning on his net pole to pin the prisoner, watched as Chuck let out a low grunt and ripped all 3 darts right out of his own flesh. A few beads of sweat-mixed blood seeped through his fingers, but he didn't even furrow his brow. "Some bitch little toys. Think you can stick old Chuck?" He spat, a glob of beer foam flying. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the 3 blood-specked darts in an arc, splashing them into the shallow water near the bank, startling a few pairs of dark green gator eyes lurking below. The airboat's heavy engine had been idling low. Chuck stomped the throttle dead to the floor. His mud-splattered chest heaved faster and faster, his previously lazy gaze instantly lighting up with terrifying intensity, glaring brighter than the million-candle-power spotlight. He violently cranked the steering wheel, aiming the spotlight dead center at the 2 hovering Vax RE skiffs, while the propeller whipped up a violent wave of foul mud and water, blasting it directly into the sky. Far away on the toxicology monitoring screens at the end of the Vax RE command chain, the final second of data loading finished, and the dark blue progress bar hit 100%. The moment the results popped up, the bony appendage of the Vax RE medical officer froze mid-air over the terminal. The Neuro Dart's ultra-potent paralyzing toxin had been completely broken down less than 10 seconds after entering the target's bloodstream. The target's blood alcohol content exceeded 0.38%, and his caffeine levels were 17 times the Vax RE physiological safety threshold. The mixture of the 2 substances entirely shattered the toxin's molecular bonds, instead catalyzing a bizarre hyperchemical stimulant reaction. The target's heart rate was spiking to 210 beats per minute, and his blood pressure broke double the human physiological limit. Not only did his cardiopulmonary system not shut down, it vaulted into a berserker threshold far beyond any normal state. Terrified screams from the troopers on the 2 skiffs instantly blew up the comms channel. Medical officer. Why isn't he down? Why is he still accelerating? The medical officer stared blankly at the blurry video feed, half the screen obscured by the 110% humidity steam. He could clearly see the bare-chested native yank the Neuro Darts out, toss them into the water, and slam the throttle. The high-powered airboat, roaring deafeningly, swept up tons of putrid muck and charged straight for the 2 hover skiffs. He swept his eyes over the armor status of the remaining 10 shock troopers and gasped. The seams of their brand-new optical camo had already soaked through. The insulation was bubbling and leaking voltage, and everybody's core temperature was spiking abnormally due to the short circuits. At the edge of the screen, the second hover skiff deployed a micro-recon drone, slowly angling it toward the rapidly approaching airboat. As the camera zoomed in, they could clearly see the sunglass-wearing native half-crouching on the gunwale. His muscles, taut as granite from the berserker stimulant reaction, were coiled and ready. Even his shoulders were vibrating faintly from sheer adrenaline. The micro-recon drone had just locked focus when Chuck kicked off the gunwale. Leaping like a lid-filled human cannonball, he launched himself straight at the drone, hovering 10 yards away. The carbon fiber chassis crunched loudly under his rough knuckles as he grabbed the drone midair, violently tearing the optical transmission lens right out of its socket. Shredded plastic and wires rained onto the deck by his feet. Clutching half of the ruined drone, he roared at the hover skiffs, his hoarse voice overpowering the engine roar. "This piece of junk is worth at least $200. I'm putting this online and selling it as an alien souvenir." Chuck stumbled as he landed back on the airboat's deck. Backhanding the million-candle power spotlight on the gunwale, he locked the beam dead onto the hulls of the two light hover skiffs. 3 kilometers away, behind the cover of the mangroves, the ground commander pressed his clammy, sweat-slicked claws against the burning tactical hologram. His compound eyes were blurring from sheer shock. Just 3 hours ago, he had guaranteed orbital command that stealth infiltrating this low-tech planet would be like slicing through butter. Now, his vanguard squad had lost 4 men. Captain Vale was MIA, and 5 reinforcements were bogged down in a mud flat, their vitals flashing deep red from mosquito and ant anaphylaxis, unable to even send a clean transmission. The remaining 10 troopers were crammed in 2 skiffs, their optical camo insulation bubbling and leaking from the 110% humidity. Pale blue sparks cascaded down the hulls, and the overheating alarms were about to shatter his comms receiver. "Commander," he just tore apart a military recon drone with his bare hands. The squad leader's shriek erupted over the comms. "Neuro darts don't work. His blood is pure alcohol and some kind of energy drink. The toxins are totally neutralized. Our camo is shorting out, and the mosquitoes are already inside our suits." The ground commander was just about to order a full suppression fire when he watched on the hologram as the 10 troopers unanimously flipped the safeties on their plasma cutters and shoved their weapons right over the edge of the skiffs. Both light hover skiffs simultaneously veered, wobbling toward the muddy bank for a crash landing. The open public broadcast channels on the skiffs blared with a collective sobbing plea, "We surrender. Please don't feed us to the alligators. Don't let the mosquitoes in." The ground commander froze, the hyper-humid air funneling through his breathing tubes into his lungs. He was just about to scream at these cowards over the comms when, over the calm swamp water in the distance, the hum of another fanboat engine grew steadily clearer. 2 Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission rangers drove their fanboat through the hyacinth-choked foul water. The sticky heat clung to their waterproof uniforms like wet cement. They were so used to it, they didn't even reach for the tasers on their belts. Nearing the bank, their eyes locked directly onto Carcouse, the alien ground commander, who was standing by the downed skiffs, his face pale, still clutching his plasma dagger. The older ranger pulled out a waterproof plastic citation clipboard, his mud-speckled fingers flipping to a fresh ticket. The younger one crouched down, gave the 2 intact hover skiffs a once-over, and punched the tonnage and pollution rating into his tablet. "Gonna need to see your protected area access permit and the emissions registration for these vehicles," the older ranger drawled, his voice lazy and completely devoid of aggression. The ground commander's compound eyes nearly popped out of his skull. He had led Vaxori's elite vanguard, lost over half his men, just watched 10 of his subordinates collectively surrender, and before he could even process it, he was hearing this. He opened his mandibles to bark an interstellar threat of conquest, only to see the old ranger rapidly scribbling out the citation. A waterproof ticket stamped with the park seal was shoved into his face, the red ink glaringly bright, a fine of $12,800. 2 violations: illegal introduction of invasive exotic species and unauthorized operation of a heavy polluting hover vehicle resulting in native wetland destruction. It had to be paid in full at the management office within 15 days, with late fees accruing daily. The ground commander's carapace locked up. He had conquered 13 star systems and had never seen anything like this. Out of pure instinct, he opened an encrypted channel to the orbital dreadnought, bundling this mud-stained ticket, which completely defied all his interstellar tactical knowledge, along with the staggering casualty report, and hit send. Up in the command bridge of the orbital dreadnought tearing claw, the cold blue holographic screens flared into blinding white. Supreme Commander Kraxus had just finished verifying the invasion vectors when Carcous's bundled casualty and citation files slammed into the comms array. Cracks' compound eyes narrowed as he scanned the casualty report, his joints popping. A 40 standard hour expedition. Vanguard squad completely wiped, or MIA. 5 reinforcements lost. 10 elite shock troopers voluntarily surrendering. And 1 stealth captain captured and shoved into a mud pit. He swiped to the next page, his eyes shrinking to pinpricks. It was a crumpled, foul-smelling, mud-stained paper ticket bearing an official Earth seal. The charges were illegal introduction of invasive exotic species, unauthorized entry into protected area, and severe wetland pollution. The total fine, converted into VAX-RE interstellar credits, was 3 times the military budget for the entire expedition. Scrolling further, he saw the vitals of the 5 swimming troopers. Every curve was nose-diving, tagged with causes like formic acid anaphylaxis and mosquito bite anaphylaxis. Not high-yield directed energy weapons, just native bugs on this planet. Cracks suddenly recalled the physiological flaws missed by intelligence. He remembered that the Empire's vaunted optical camo short-circuited and leaked voltage in 110% humidity. He realized this entire Everglades sector was basically a tub of toxic acid that could annihilate them. This wasn't some primitive, uncontacted rock. This was a high-tier biohazard hellhole hidden in the galactic suburbs. Cracks violently smashed the star map on the command console and roared into the fleet-wide comms. Divert all power to engines. Sever all ground communication frequencies. Abandon all ground units. Initiate hyperspace jump, now. The pale blue halo of a hyperspace jump had already engulfed the dreadnought's hull, the countdown hitting the final second. Down in the Everglades, the 98-degree wind, reeking of mud and swamp gas, plastered against the FWC Rangers' reflective vests. Sweat rolled down their collars, soaking the freshly written ticket. Just as they shoved the citation clipboard back into its waterproof sleeve, they saw the pale blue hyperspace halo vanish from the edge of the clouds overhead. The VAX-RE orbital dreadnought hadn't left so much as a shadow. It had completely bailed. Off in the shallows, a pitch-shifting scream echoed out, mixed with the heavy thud of a gator's tail slapping the water. The remaining VAX-RE soldiers froze. Seconds ago, they were on their toes waiting for the fleet to bring them home. Now, there was nothing left but the stench of mud, the deafening buzz of mosquitoes, and countless pairs of alligator eyes glowing terrifyingly bright in the dusk. The 2 FWC Rangers unhurriedly nudged their fanboat closer to the bank. Angled on the stern were 3 heavy-duty, solid steel cages, prepped for transporting illegally released large predators. The cage doors hung open. The thumb-thick steel bars gleamed coldly in the twilight, sturdy enough that even a 12-foot gator couldn't bust through. The alien ground commander, previously hiding behind the brush, poked his head out. He looked at the 3 open steel cages, then glanced at the massive gator silhouette slowly crawling out of the water toward the bank. It was Princess, and the drag of her tail was shaking the very grass under his feet. He swallowed a gulp of mosquito blood-laced saliva, gripped his lone plasma dagger, and stepped forward. Violently stabbing the dagger into the mud, he turned to his surviving troops and squeezed out a hoarse command. All of them scrambled and shoved their way through the narrow cage doors. Finally, the ground commander hunched over, squeezed himself in, and slammed the deadbolt shut. The thick steel bars bruised his shoulder. He leaned against the cold cage wall, just about to catch his breath, when he heard it, the roaring fanboat engine echoing across the murky water, getting closer and closer. The deafening engine roar rattled the muddy ground. Tons of stinking, humid mist blew off the airboat's massive fan, showering the dirt around the cages. Chuck, his tattooed chest bare and his mullet dripping with rotting waterweed, let his aviators slide down his nose. Pinching a half-empty can of cold Busch Light in his left hand, he yanked the tiller hard toward his chest with his right. The 100-horsepower flat-bottom airboat screeched to a halt right against the muddy bank, violently shaking the surrounding water hyacinths. He chugged the rest of his beer, crushed the can on the deck, and hopped off. Tossing two heavy waterproof-coated tow ropes, he effortlessly lashed the two surrendered, fully intact light hover skiffs to the back of his airboat, patted the hull, and spat, "Some bitches picked some sturdy hardware." I ripped the turbines out of this and slap 'em on my base boat. It'll be pushing 60 out on the water. Bob, hauling his heavy dip net, waded silently through knee-deep black mud to the pit where he had pinned Captain Vale earlier. With a heavy scoop of the net, he yanked the stealth captain, now completely coated in sludge, his camo suit bubbling and arcing electricity, straight out of the muck. With a flick of his wrist, like he was tossing a fresh-caught soft-shell turtle, he chucked Vale with a heavy thud right into the last empty steel cage. Inside the completely packed cages, the remaining Vax RE soldiers whimpered and shrank into the corners. Their armor hissed with weak electrical arcs, their faces swollen beyond recognition, covered in red welts from mosquito bites and fire ant acid. Chuck swaggered over, tapping his knuckles against the steel bars with a ding, then flicked on the million-candle-power spotlight. The blinding beam obliterated the swampy twilight, making the huddled aliens curl up even tighter. The two wildlife rangers rolled the three locked steel cages onto their pickup trailer, slapped the mandatory hazardous exotic species warning labels on them, honked the horn, and kicked up a cloud of dirt as they drove down the mud road, leaving Chuck and Bob resting by the boat. Chuck, bare-chested and dripping with foul, muddy sweat from his mullet, was still rocking his aviators in the middle of the night. He squatted on the dented deck of his airboat, yanking a plasma battery ripped right out of the surrendered alien skiff. He casually snapped off the insulation terminals, twisted two copper wires, and jammed them straight into the plug of his beat-up truck bed mini-fridge. The fridge hummed to life with a whir, kicking out twice the power of his old generator. Out in the shallows, the muffled sound of a gator's tail slapping the water echoed. The 5 Vax RE troopers stuck in the mud were still groaning from anaphylactic shock. They weren't going anywhere anyway. The FWC guys could just pick 'em up on their morning rounds. Chuck pulled an ice-cold, condensation-slicked can of Busch Light out of the cooler. His rough finger popped the tab with a crisp crack, and beer foam ran down his mud-caked elbow, splashing onto his torn cut-off jorts. Bob, leaning on the handle of his massive dip net, tossed over a lit cigarette. The headlights on the distant highway had gone dark. A group of neighbors carrying ice chests and cameras were already trudging through the mud, yelling about taking pictures with live aliens for social media likes and splitting the loot of half a case of beer. High up in the night sky, the pale blue afterglow of the Vax RE Dreadnought's hyperspace jump hadn't fully dissipated. Chuck took a massive swig of ice-cold beer, raised the can toward that fading speck of light, and flashed a foam-covered grin. "Next time y'all come down, remember to pay the park entry fee and your damn pollution fines, you sons of bitches."
Hey everyone, Author here. After finishing this swamp-soaked, chaotic sci-fi short story, I feel like I've just chugged an ice-cold Busch Light myself. It's intensely satisfying and completely absurd. The inspiration for this story came from my absolute fascination with the stark contrast between a high-tech, arrogant alien empire and the raw, unhinged reality of Earth's wildest places. In traditional sci-fi, alien armadas always arrive with overwhelming superiority, and humanity usually has to rely on plot armor, super geniuses, or deep philosophical epiphanies to survive the invasion. But I couldn't help but wonder, what if they dropped into the Florida Everglades in August? What if the weapons that defeated them weren't orbital lasers or nuclear codes, but Iliawad 110% humidity, a dark cloud of toxic mosquitoes, pissed off 12-foot alligators, and a Florida man slamming cheap beers to Southern rock? Writing this was incredibly cathartic. I deliberately highlighted the fragility of the Vaxary's state-of-the-art tech when faced with the sheer brute force of Mother Nature. Whether it's their pristine optical camo short-circuiting in the muck, or their deadly neurotoxins being completely neutralized by a lethal human cocktail of alcohol and caffeine, the story is really a twisted love letter to this beautiful, brutal blue planet we call home. We humans have survived here for so long that we've not only adapted to its wildness, but we've learned to have a damn good time right in the middle of fire ants and hurricanes. Chuck and Bob are your traditional heroes. They're rough around the edges, entirely unapologetic, and maybe a little unhinged. But their relaxed, business-as-usual attitude, no matter what interstellar threat drops from the sky, is the exact kind of gritty human resilience and dark comedy I wanted to capture. I hope that when you read or listen to this, you feel that kinetic joy. Next time you look up at the stars, just remember if aliens ever do visit, they better bring bug spray. And they definitely shouldn't mess with Florida.